Hello and welcome to this Fane online event. It's an evening with Orlaine McDonald. My name is Salma El-Wadani, author of These Impossible Things, and I have the very great pleasure of being in conversation with Orlaine tonight, which is also the polite way of saying that I get to ask her everything that popped into my head when reading her debut novel, which is hugely exciting for me. I've got it here with me, no small thing. I'm going to give you a little debrief of the story, and then Orlaine, I know you're going to give us a little bit of a reading from it. But No Small Things is very much a novel about what it means to be a mother and how to be a daughter when all you want is a mother. It explores the difficulties that lie in mother daughter relationships and what happens when a woman's personal desires conflict with her role as a mother and what society expects of her as a mother. The story follows Livia's daughter Mickey, and Mickey's daughter Summer. After falling on hard times and being evicted from their flat, Mickey and Summer turn up on Livia's doorstep after years of not talking. Mickey is angry at her mother for leaving. Summer doesn't really know who her grandmother is, and they're each desperate to be mothered. Over a year, we witness what happens when those three generations share a confined space with one another, what it means to be poor, and how the relentless grind of life can fundamentally change who you are. It's a novel that is so beautifully written. The pain is very much laced with poetry that you can't help but feel it very deep in your chest. At least I certainly did when I read through it. We're going to get into so much of this novel, and I'm so excited to do that. But Orlaine, I'm going to hand over to you. I think you're going to give us a little bit of a reading from the beginning.
Yeah, thank you, Salma. For 1 year, the three of them had lived in the flat below his on the Blossom View estate. 3 females, black women, brown-skinned, skin tones from deepest cinnamon to buttermilk. 1 September until the next. Time enough for the majestic maple tree standing sentry over the squat 3-story blocks of flats and masonettes to flush gold and back again. The foxes to mate and multiply, slipping like shadows in and out of the helter-skelter undergrowth bordering the edges. For the pine trees to remain unchanged, stretching upwards, stoic and aloof, and the rowan trees to bud, then drip with bright red berries by mid-May. His balcony thickened with leaf and fruit, his mint and strawberry, his bergamot and night phlox, exulting in all the sun and rain that year, then easing back on themselves as the earth began its slow cooling. 3 women. Until the day one of them climbed up the metal staircase of the water tower, the highest point on the estate. Up and up until she'd reached the flat roof of the block opposite and taken flight, launching herself off and out into the gauzy autumn sky, arms outstretched and then flailing, pumping the air as if she was racing against the downward swoop of it all, racing herself to the ground below, the tarmac car park, the unforgiving cushion of concrete. And then there were 2. Lots of people claimed to have witnessed it, others just heard about it and convinced themselves they'd seen it, discussed it endlessly, for a while anyway. Earl hadn't seen it, and he was glad. Better to remember a person with the life still in her, the kind of life that just sings of a person, from her eyes and her bones and her skin and her hair. Better that than the shattered and broken remains, the blood seeping out all around her like a cape, bright and fresh as those rowan tree berries. Earl wasn't an authority on much, but he did know that a seed can take root and flourish, and like all earthly things, must wither and fade. And though one of them would be lost, her light extinguished forever, and though he tried to understand what needed to be done that year, to save her, to save them all, he knows he failed. But he'd like to return to that year, set it down, place each month side by side, an act of remembrance.
Oh, so beautifully done. And what a remarkable opener. And I've got a question about the opening of this novel in a little bit, which I will get to, but it really punched me straight in the gut when I read that, and it hooks you immediately into the novel. And like I said, we'll get to that. But let me start by rewinding a little bit. Orlaine, I read a quote from you in which you said that as a kid, life could be unpredictable, but reading felt like a superpower. And I suppose I wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like and how books featured in it.
Yeah, okay. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s in so I was born in Birmingham, and by the time I was about 6 or 7, we were moved by Birmingham City Council to a new housing development in a small market town called Tamworth. So we were living in a high rise in Birmingham at the time, and in order for us to have the option of living in a house, we had to move, and we did, like lots of us, and we were collectively people that moved from Birmingham to this sort of new estate we were called the Overspill. So Birmingham City Council had brought this land, built it because of the housing issues back then. And so grew up in I grew up with a white mom, who from Ireland. Her family were from Ireland, and a black dad. My dad is Jamaican. My dad was around sometimes and sometimes not around. And so I grew up with my mom and my younger brother and sister on this new housing estate, and it was just white people. My primary school, when we lived there, when we first moved there, it literally was just one estate, and then eventually they started building other estates. So there were no roads, there were no shops, there was no doctors, so we had to walk sort of a 25-minute, 30-minute walk down into the village, where there were a village school. So I started my from about 7 to 11, I was at primary school there, and I found that really, really hard. I found my childhood quite tricky, despite my mom and dad being, really trying their best and being really loving, and aspirational. We struggled financially, and being the only black kid for miles around was really tricky for me.
And it's such a story actually that has resonance today because that story of kind of councils moving families, that's still something that we're very much seeing. And books as a way of escapism in all of that is quite remarkable that it can just take you out of the physicality of your surroundings.
Yeah, definitely. Although I was an academic and I didn't do particularly well at school, I learnt to read really, really early. And reading to me was such a life-saving thing, because I spent a lot of my childhood being quite fearful and quite anxious. I had a lot of responsibilities for looking after my younger brother and sister. I was bullied at school. Reading was just this amazing escape. Um, and yeah, although my mom and dad really understood the importance of reading, certainly there were some family members where my reading, my I would read all the time. It was almost seen as, but there's something a little bit wrong with her. She's always reading. You need to put that book away now, or like
Yeah,
get
join the
on.
real world.
Yeah, and so I was also a slight embarrassment because I would always have a book in my hand, but it was a way for me to escape. Um, so yeah,
Absolutely. What were some of your favorite books as a child?
the names of my favorite books.
Yeah, is there one that you had that kind of
Oh
stood out? I don't
God.
know. I feel like we all have one or two that kind of were
I
distinctive
mean,
childhood books.
I read whatever I could really get my hands on. I read everything. I read newspapers. I read women's magazines. I loved. My mom would get My Weekly and Women's
Yeah,
Elm and Women's Own, and I adored them. I liked anything lurid. Um, but then I got into Enid Blyton. But I
yeah,
loved her.
same. I love
I
them.
loved her.
Mallory Towers
Oh my
for
God, Mallory
hours.
Towers.
Yeah,
And part of me felt that if I could go to boarding school, maybe life would be, you know,
Everything would be perfect, wouldn't it? If
yeah,
you
I
could just go
mean,
and have midnight feast and play croquet or
yeah,
whatever it was they were
yeah.
doing in Mallory's
Even though
house.
there were no brown skinned girls in Enid Blyton. Well,
At
often
all.
the darker hued girls were slightly tricksy, weren't they? And even
Yeah.
even I picked up on it then, thinking, "Oh,
Yeah.
Enid Blyton."
Same. But when you're a black or a brown kid going to the library, getting books out, if you are going to the local library, which certainly we were, because no one
Yeah.
was buying them in mass volume in that way,
Mhm.
there was a limit of what was available for
Yeah.
kids like us to see themselves in books. And yes, there's changes now, but it certainly wasn't true back then, for sure.
Yeah. So
And
that, yeah,
those,
those were really important to me. I
mm,
loved them.
there's this childhood nostalgia to them, isn't there? That every
Yeah.
time you see it, you're like, even though I know it's problematic, and even
Yeah.
though I did not see myself in the pages, there's still something that ties you to the world that was an escape, right?
Yeah.
That allowed you to be somewhere else. Well, let's talk about that tremendous opening that you just read for us. And it is a real grab you by the throat opening. And it compels you to finish the book as quickly as possible because you have to know who it is. Who is it? And you're thinking that constantly. I certainly was. As I was reading through the book and throughout these women and girls, their stories, I was wondering, could that compel you to end up on the very top of that building? And it was something that I returned to so consistently. Did you always know that you were going to start the book in that way? Because it's bold and it's brilliant, but it's painful and it's sharp at the same time.
Um, I would say yes, because it was the image of a woman falling or throwing herself from the top of a building that was the spark for me. And the image came from an awful real life story that was in the news. It must have been about 10 to 15 years ago. And it was two French girls threw themselves off a block of flats. Um, and it was like a suicide pact thing. And awful, terrible. And the awfulness of it and the terribleness of it, of these two young, they were young, 15 or something like that, really, really got to me. And I cut out the article, and I didn't, and I couldn't forget that image. And then I suppose as a writer, although I didn't much consider myself much of a writer back then, I was doing bits and pieces. I kept thinking, what had happened for those girls to make that choice? Um, and then you kind of think about mental health, and suicide is something that has occurred in my family as well. And I think from that awful image and that awful knowledge of people, of a person doing that, Mickey sort of came to me. So it very much started with Mickey, thinking about her. Then I came to Summer, and then finally to Livia. So I think when I started writing this properly, like not just skirting around the edges and writing bits and pieces, thinking I'm going to write this, I didn't think that would stay the opening. I kind of wrote that just for me to get into to get into it. Um, but then I decided to keep it there.
And a good job you did, because it's incredible, but it's remarkable how the genesis of a novel comes about. And I find it so interesting talking to different authors, and it's all so wildly different. And the fact that that story, that news story, was so compelling. I mean, how many years has that news story sat with you before you put pen to paper for no small thing?
Oh, years. I
It's
mean,
wild.
more than 10 years.
And I just find that so remarkable that then sparks such a huge myriad of characters and their complexities and their pains and their joys and everything that's going on behind it. No small thing is about many things, which we will discuss, but overwhelmingly, it's about motherhood. Why was this the story that you wanted to start with as your debut? Why was this the story that was going to launch your novel and your novel writing career? Because of course you've written extensively in poetry, etc. But why was this the topic that you began?
I think I think I started with Mickey, and then this daughter came, and very quickly, because Mickey came to me as this very brittle, um, quite unlikable young woman in many aspects. And I wanted to explore that. And I suppose I wanted to explore why, what was her thing? What was this cross she was bearing, kind of thing. And it just felt right that in order to understand Mickey, I needed to go back and understand her beginnings. And to do that, I needed to understand Livia. And then Livia started to kind of make herself known. Initially, she was just kind of a mom, but that was on the periphery. And then as I did many drafts and sort of explored and interrogated the material that I was coming up with and trying different things, she became more alive and more real and more and just as complex and complicated. And I think then what I was very, very interested in was this complex dynamic between mothers and daughters.
Complex is the word for it, indeed. And in literature and popular culture, motherhood is depicted as something glowing and beautiful. And certainly in those women's magazines that you talked about that you loved reading about as a kid, right? It's always this gorgeous experience and it's very closely connected with Mother Nature. And it's a wholesome experience that is something that completes women. At least that's the narrative that we have in our society. It gives them purpose. But that certainly isn't on the page of No Small Thing. Were you worried at all about writing a version of motherhood in which women often fail to be good mothers or even show up at all?
No, in fact, I felt
Yes,
not at all.
I was so hoping you were going to say that, and
Yeah,
I'm so glad you did.
yeah, no. In fact, I wanted to smash that myth because it's so pervasive, isn't it? And I think it, even as I was a young mom, so became a mom in 88, and there was no social media. But still there was a pressure. And I think now, when I think about my daughter who has got a 2.5 year old, her experience of being a first time mother and my experience of being a first time mother, this pressure and this almost constant need to prove yourself and constantly kind of measuring yourself against other women. And of course, we know that social media is just that, it's there to show the best. It's a facade, isn't it? It's a veneer. And I think that can be so damaging when we are in
Mm.
our most vulnerable state. And as I think when we've given birth or when we're pregnant or in those first few years, as women, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to all sorts of things. So yeah, I definitely wanted to smash that myth.
And I'm so glad you did. And it's so interesting that you said that. So when you watch your daughter raising her children, and like you said, at a time where social media and everything is online and it's very much a highlights reel, and parenthood, motherhood is not a highlight reel whatsoever, especially in those early years. I've got some friends going through it right now and they're just in this haze of pain and this other world that you just can't access them. Do you look at her raising her kid and think, I had an easier time of it, or are the challenges just different?
I think sometimes I feel that I did have an easier time just because there seemed to be less of a less external pressure from society. In my circle, I mean, like I've said, I was young. It was unexpected pregnancy. My parents were devastated when I got pregnant at 18. My school friends were confused. What are you doing? I felt I'd let everyone down. And I felt a real desire to prove to people that I could do this. But that was just in my kind of circle. That I wasn't looking at. I wasn't exposed to a relentless kind of film reel of perfect parenting,
Right.
which I think my daughter and women that are having children now are having to deal with. And you have to kind of shut off with all social media. There are times when we just have to shut that noise off. But it's something else we've got to do, isn't it? You
It's just
know?
another thing on the to-do list that is already far too long. But
Yeah.
your portrayal of motherhood is it's painful and it's sharp. And I found it so breathtakingly honest, especially that conflict of just a woman's basic desires, and that just because she had a child, it didn't mean she still didn't have dreams of her own or hopes for her future. And that's what I find quite remarkable and also redeeming about all of the mothers in this book, even the ghost of Livia's mother, who talks to her. And she's kind of, I mean, the ghost of her is too strong to say, but she's having conversations in her head with her mother who's no longer alive. And you don't ever meet that character. You only hear of her through Livia's perception and Livia having those conversations. But even so, you still get this really strong sense that these are all women who had hopes, regardless of the offspring that they produced. And I think that in of itself is quite remarkable to see on the page, because I've certainly never seen it before, because it's that awful thing that we do to women that the minute they become mothers, they are nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and this sort of pressure to be the perfect mother, and yeah, and you can't, it's so difficult to, and it doesn't seem to extend to fathers too much, does it? I
No,
think
not at
men
all. No,
men
no, they can have children and then have their whole complex personalities intact.
well, I sometimes find, and sometimes I think, is it me being too too fixated on it? But if you see newspaper articles about something that's happened to a person, if it's a woman and she's of a certain age, it's often a 55-year-old grandmother was in a da, 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 da. But you rarely see 55-year-old grandfather.
No, never. They're never defined by their
He's a
offspring in
man.
the way women are. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I find
Yeah,
that, yeah, and I feel that's unfair. And it's something I've struggled with. This, I am also Orlaine. Um, and my family laugh at me, but when my granddaughter was born, the big question is, what's she going to call you? What are you going to be, Nana, Nanny, Granny? I said, none of those. I'm going to, but I'd rather she call me Orlaine. That's my name if I have a choice. And we've kind of settled on Oni, which,
okay.
yeah. Um, but there are people in my family that I think were a bit like, oh, who does she think she is? Just, you're a granny, be a granny. But I just really bristled against another. I'm already a mom. I've been a
Yeah,
wife.
yeah.
I didn't want to just add this extra label on me just when I'm starting to feel like Orlaine again. I'm
Right,
single,
because you
my
go
kids are
through it.
adults. I've been
Right.
there, I've done it. And now my child has decided to have a child. I, I don't need another label.
I find that remarkable, and I love that you've figured out your own little word that you and your granddaughter are going to have for one another, or grandchild are going to have for one another, because you're right, the labels are incessant and they just pile on quite heavily. This novel is, I mean, it's a story about race and racism and class and poverty and abuse. And when you stop to think about the themes in the book, it can feel like quite a long and painful list. Yet you were so incredibly deft with how you dealt with those themes. For example, in the case of Earl, who is the upstairs neighbor, his backstory of losing his mother to police brutality is slipped in almost quietly. It's a real gasp moment and a horrific ordeal described so viscerally, but it also feels very quick. Was that intentional, slipping what are very difficult to talk about topics into these very brief moments in the book?
I'm not sure it was intentional. Um, but I felt in trying to understand Earl, and trying to understand what his mindset was. I think like with all the characters, I think, and it's not just Earl, I think with each of the characters, every time I sat down to write a section for them, I I had to really embody, I had to really go into who they were, and in some ways allow them to speak to me and just open myself up to who is this person. And it was important to do that, to find their truth. And so I just, when it came to Earl, it was very clear why are you like you are? What is it about you? Um, and I felt that in order for him to be living in this way and to be so fixated on these women, and especially Summer, there had to be some interruption to the mothering that he'd experienced, that he somehow could identify something with the three women who in all of them there'd been some kind of interruption to that mother bond that he could see. And I think then it was just, okay, what is it? And landed on that as an explanation for who he is.
I thought his character was so intriguing. And what I loved that you did in the book was that you often see every character from everyone else's perspective, because you're constantly shifting between the characters. And when you think you've got one character sorted and your mind made up about them, you would see Earl, for example, through Summer's eyes, or you would see him through Livia's eyes when they were passing in the hall, and it would shift your perception of him one more time. And I would find myself grappling once again with who he was, and that was true of all the characters, which I think is such a clever way of presenting those characters and showing all of their sides instead of being quite hemmed in by one narrator or hemmed in by one perspective throughout the novel. It gave such a 360 picture of everyone and what was going on in this block of flats and a South London estate. Um, One of the other strands in the book that really stuck out for me, and it's subtle and it's about female friendship, and it's a topic that I'm personally obsessed with. I wrote a whole novel about it, but it's also a topic that is difficult and it's thorny, and there is often a dark underbelly to female friendship that is rarely spoken about. And you describe it so brilliantly on page 133. And I wonder if you might read us that passage.
Okay. Mothers do not leave their children. Wives do not leave their gentle, hard-working husbands. The speed with which my few female friends scattered, like mice after an earthquake, was testament to this. Though perhaps it was more my refusal to share with them, lean on them, make them understand. They wanted reasons, details. They wanted to share in my pain. They wanted the dirt of it, the ugliness. They wanted to pick it over without me present. They wanted to stare at it from the sanctity of cleanliness of their own lives. They wanted to take it home to their husbands as a warning, a decapitated horse head left on the doorsteps of their marriages. See what women are capable of. See what we can do. My silence took this from them. My refusal to justify, explain, weep. I robbed them.
Oh, I love it so much. Thank you for that. Orlaine, that line particularly resonated with me. They wanted to take it home to their own husbands as a warning, a decapitated horse head left on the doorsteps of their marriages. See what women are capable of, see what we can do. I've got a whole post-it note dedicated to it in my copy of the book because it just sent chills down my spine. And there was almost something, sorry, I'm going to pick up that line, sorry. I loved it so much. There was almost something visceral and vulgar about it, about that insight into a woman's mind and why she wants to then get all of the gory details from her friend about what bad thing has happened. And I truly adored it. I think it was such a brilliantly written line. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit more about your thinking behind it. And, the friendship in this, I guess we see mainly through Mickey and her friend. And we get Mickey's internal dialogue about any jealousies that she might feel. And then we get a little bit there from Livia. What did you want to say about female friendship when you were writing it, and what was going through your mind?
I mean, I'm really glad that you picked out the theme of friendship. It wasn't so it wasn't at the forefront of what I wanted to put on the page, but I did in creating these women, I did think about what their friendships would look like. And it became clear to me that, well, all of them, if you think about Summer and her friendship with Marlon, and Mickey with her friend Tiffany, and Olivia, who seems to be without friends, is that these women are prickly. It's that complexity, isn't it, that I think make them really, really tricky to be friends with. I could imagine.
Prickly is a subtle way of saying it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you kind of probably wouldn't know where you quite stood with all three of them. And I think it was that in trying to understand these women, how do they relate to other people? And I think there's problems. It's problematic. All their relationships are problematic to a certain extent. But I think that passage that you picked out, for me, that was very much about the way we have double standards for women, and that women that don't leave. And I think, you know, if we think about women who the way women often treat other women, and can be less than generous in certain situations. So, a woman can have, and say, for instance, in a workplace, a woman could have a man and a woman, two colleagues could have an affair, but it's the woman who gets the negative,
Yeah, she's the home wrecker. She's the
is the
one
home.
that's smashed everything up as opposed to the man taking any accountability for it.
Yes. And, and that's something that I think I wanted to kind of explore, that Livia had stepped outside of what was okay. But also that there was part of them that were slightly, you know, excited by it as well, because they hadn't done that, or they hadn't thought of doing that.
Right.
So that kind of mixed emotions of, that's really shocking, but also, wow.
Yeah, and I really love that you have all of that meshing together in Livia, because she is a character who, as she describes herself, she stands and she watches and she waits for trouble to pass. She does not get involved. She is not confrontational. She is always in the shadows. She's always trying to avoid the difficult and the hard. And yet at the same time, there is this bursting desire in her that just lives beneath the surface of her, that never breaks out. And I think there's one passage in the book where she says, all the things that she wants to one of her bosses, that the man that she cleans houses for. But then she says in her head, these are things that I'll never say. There is a whole other woman that lives beneath the surface of Livia. And it's fascinating to see that juxtaposition on the page throughout the novel.
Yeah, I think the important thing for me as well with Livia is that she's a woman in her 50s. And I I don't always think that we don't always see complex women in their 50s on the page, or on the screen. I think it's something that we'll see being represented in better ways, maybe as time goes on. But certainly in literature, I think even some of the novels that I really love by writers that I really respect. If you've got a mom, a character who's in her 50s and she's the mom, she's a bit, bit cardboard, a bit wooden, a bit that
Boring. She's boring.
yeah. And I really wanted to show that this woman in her 50s, I wanted to show that she'd had this life-changing sexual affair and that she had felt desire. Um, and that she didn't fit she didn't fit into the confines of what a woman in her 50s should be doing or saying
Yeah.
or thinking.
And let's talk about sex for a moment because it's woven in through Livia's affair and the very big desires that she has. And then Mickey as well is very much a sexual creature who is also using it as an escape. And there's one line that stuck out to me so much when, and I'm not sure what we're allowed to say in terms of spoilers or whether everyone's read it or not. So I'm not really sure where else. So I'll try and describe this without giving any spoilers, but it's towards the end of the book. And she says that she wanted to fuck him so hard so that she could rearrange him. And I found that such a remarkable depiction of female sexuality and just the aggression in it as well, which again is not something that you talk about when it comes to women and pleasure and desire, because God forbid they were ever aggressive or had any kind of ugly tendencies to their want. And I just wanted to ask you about that and what portrayal of female sexuality you wanted to get across to the reader, and how important was it for you that these women were sexual creatures?
um I felt it was just really important again to examine and to maybe unpick some of the way women are portrayed and how their desires are portrayed depending on what age they are. Um, and I just wanted to make for Mickey, sex is a bit like alcohol. It is an escape. It is something that she can just take hold of and become someone else. And of course, deep down, it is a need to be loved, isn't it? That's where it comes from. But I wanted to show that's it can be powerful, but it can be ugly. It can be unwieldy. It's something that can be really difficult to control, really difficult to manage. Um, I wanted Mickey's sexuality to kind of spill over a little bit because and be something that she can't always control because she is something that she can't always control. And I think for Livia, I wanted to show how I think she'd spent a lot of her young womanhood and then being a young mother and being a wife repressing who she is, what she wants, and then the affair that she has kind of explodes all that. Um, and I wanted to show how again how I don't know what the word is. It's how animalistic it can be.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad you used the word ugly because there is that undercurrent. And I loved it. I found it refreshing and I found it so visceral and raw on the page. And I'm so glad you didn't shy away from it, as you haven't done with any of it. It's what makes this book so remarkable is that you show that underbelly to every part, whether that be female friendship or sexuality or motherhood. There is no stepping away from the ugly, dirty, gritty nature of it. But there is still so much compassion for these women in the book. And I found that so remarkable that you've written them so kindly at the same time, as well as showing all of this ugliness, as well as showing the difficulties and the wrong choices that these women have made as well. There have been many of them in the book. And there's been times when I was reading, I wanted to grab them and just shake them and think, come on, get it together. You guys can do this. You can figure this out. And so they are frustrating, but there is a world of compassion. And you can, as you go through the novel, it is so understandable to me, and it certainly was, how each of these women had arrived at the places that they had arrived at. And I suppose that leads me into my next question, which was about how brilliantly you describe the way Black women are dealt with by institutions, whether that's CAMS, for example, whether that's educational establishments, and how quickly those who are vulnerable can be denied help or support. And I know you've worked extensively with young people in youth offending units, in arts, education for young people. And I wonder how much of your experience you included in the book, in that, or how much you took from the places that you've worked, just in terms of the way the systems put in place to protect those who are vulnerable often fail to do so.
Yeah, great question. Um, yeah, I've worked in education for nigh on, I don't know, 30 years now in various guises. And in the last in 20 odd years worked in primary education, supporting vulnerable children and families. And I've worked with some amazing educators. I've worked with some amazing teachers, amazing support staff in different schools across London. But in that time, and especially when I was maybe going into schools as a kind of visitor, and you can very easily be invisible sitting in staff rooms. I have experienced as well how education, people that work in education, can view women like Mickey, women like Livia, children like Summer. And it is a truth that there can be judgments, and there can be a, what is this mom on? Why can't she get out of bed in the morning? You know, but for all the wonderful educators I've worked with, there have been instances where I have observed that judgment. And of course, I've been on the other side. I have been, I have been a vulnerable mom. I have had to sit in meetings. In my family, we have I have family members that have had to be involved in CAMS, and where various children within my close family have struggled with going to school, and so have seen it from all sides. And it was really, really important for me not to romanticize schools, because I wanted very much to show it from these women's point of view, and to show that, yeah, those judgments can be there, and those challenges and those kind of myths about especially young Black women can be there, and can be shared, and kind of built on, in a way that can be really, really destructive.
And there's still, in the same way that you said about great educators that you work with, Mrs. Jukes, the head teacher for summer. I mean, I have a lot of compassion for her. You can tell that she is frustrated with the position that everyone finds themselves in, and the system as well, while still being part of the system, while trying to use the system to help Summer. And all of those complexities and frustrations just layer on top of one another. And for all that the book, and I think this is important to touch on as we kind of near the end, for all the book deals with the ugly, the underbellies, the grit, the pain, and it is painful. I found it so beautiful to read, and I also at the same time found it so painful, because your writing is so visceral and it comes across the precise feeling. So there is an element of pain when I was reading it, and yet through this there is joy in it, and there are these shotgun moments of sparkling joy in it. And I think particularly about that scene when they have the picnic for Summer's birthday, and they are dancing on the grass in the sun, and you see it through the eyes of Earl, the neighbor. And there's a reckless abandon to it. And in that moment, with the music playing and them coming together through the music and celebrating someone's birthday, it's an exquisitely beautiful portrait that you show of, I think, what it could be like, perhaps if all of these people were afforded more help and care, and if the world hadn't been built the way it is, and it wasn't as cruel as it can be. There's this flash of a sliding door moment of what they could be as a family, and I found that extraordinarily beautiful. And I imagine that joy was something that was very important to lace through it as well.
Yeah, I think so. Um, I really enjoyed writing that scene, actually. And I felt that, and it's funny, isn't it? Because sometimes it can be where families, where there are a lot, with fragmented families, where there is real conflict. It's amazing how, and certainly this is it in my family, there can be all sorts of conflicts and difficulties. But if it's someone's birthday, we pull together.
Yes, everything gets put on hold, like for
Yeah,
the birthdays. Yes,
yeah,
it doesn't matter what personal qualms you
exactly.
have. Yeah.
Yeah. And it might all, of course, what I didn't show in that scene, and it might not have happened, but, what I didn't show was maybe, Mickey then getting drunk drunk, and it all, because those are the things I remember as a kid, that everything could be really shiny and lovely, but you never know when something might just, tip because someone's had too much to drink, or,
Yeah, it's always balancing on that hairpin of pleasure and pain, and you don't know which way it could go, and inevitably, it's always going to go. But it was, I mean, you can tell that you loved writing that as well, because it really comes across on the page. It stood out for me. I suppose before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about one of the most standout moments in the book for me, certainly. And it's when Livia is talking to her dead mother, Miriam, and her mother says to her, "It's no small thing, Olivia, to be a mother." And of course, it's the book's title as well. And honestly, I found it utterly heartbreaking, that line. It really shattered me. And I suppose I wanted to find out from you what you wanted to convey in that moment. And did you intend for it to be so gut wrenching?
No, I don't think I intended it to be gut-wrenching. I apologize.
Don't. I
Um,
mean, it's remarkable.
I
I find that so exquisite that you can do that.
Thank you. I think it was needing Miriam, disembodied Miriam, to really try and get Livia to understand why she made some of the choices she made. Now, of course, is it's not a supernatural novel. Miriam's not a ghost. I felt very strongly that this is Livia conjuring Miriam out of grief and unresolved loss. I think, and that is something I can personally relate to. Having lost my mom when I was in my mid-20s, my mom was very young. Is you can't accept, there's no accepting that they've gone, because it's too soon. And so as the person that is left, there are all these questions and this unfinished business that I think Livia was doing. What I have done is you form them yourself. You have to, because there is no one there to give you what you need anymore. So you create it. So I think in a way it's Livia understanding that it was hard for Miriam, and trying to find acceptance within. I was doing my best, as you are doing your best, Livia, as Mickey is doing her best.
exactly that. And it really felt like in those moments when she's conjuring up her mother, she is also trying to find compassion for herself. She's trying to find a way to tell herself, you haven't been perfect, but it's okay. You're doing what you can. And I won't spoil this for anyone who hasn't read it yet, but Livia's progression throughout, I thought it was phenomenal and such an extraordinary display of the very different stages, I think, of motherhood and how perhaps not all is lost. Um, Orlaine McDonald, the book is a triumph. Congratulations. It's so beautiful and so poetic. And I think we could do another hour on just the poetry within this, but I'm sure we don't have time for that. But thank you so much for joining me in conversation about it because it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Salma. I've had a blast talking about it with you, and you were just the perfect person. And I'm so glad you enjoyed it and you got something out of it. And I'm just you are just the person that I would want to really love my book. So
Orlaine McDonald, thank you so much for being in conversation with me about No Small Thing. The book is a triumph. I loved every single moment of it. You can buy it now. It's out. You can get it in all good and bad bookshops. You can get it everywhere online, in the physical bookshops, in the independent bookshops to support them because that is important, obviously. And I'm sure you can follow Orlaine on the socials as well. And of course, the biggest thank you to you who has joined us this evening for this Fane online event. Thank you so much for being here. And Orlaine, huge thank you to you.
thank you.